When you turn on the news and hear about housing discrimination, you're probably hearing about it in the context of Donald Trump's history of rental discrimination against Black people. And while news networks should be calling out the president's racism, the story you need to be hearing is that millions of people are still being discriminated against every year in America when they try to rent or buy a home.
There's no question that the media is sorely undercovering this issue. It isn't getting the attention that it needs, and it isn't enough to cover it just in the context of the Trump administration's under-enforcement.
We talked to Vanita Gupta, who has devoted her career to civil rights work. She was appointed by President Obama as Chief Civil Rights Prosecutor and headed the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division.
We have long been involved in the fight for fair housing. We were involved in helping to craft and shepherd through the Fair Housing Act years ago, and really in ensuring that its promise is been implemented and executed since its passage.
The Fair Housing Act, which turns 50 this year, prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of dwellings based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It was amended in 1988 to include those with disabilities and to also prohibit discrimination based on familial status. But developers, landlords, banks, and lenders still discriminate against brown and Black people, the poor, the formerly incarcerated, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, young people, and single women. How is this possible? Banks continue to discriminate in who they lend to, and most people need help from loans to buy a home. Black applicants were turned away at significantly higher rates than whites in 48 cities, Latinx people in 25, Asians in 9, and Native Americans in 3. And in Washington, D.C., Reveal found all 4 groups were significantly more likely to be denied a home loan than white people. And just a few years ago, Bank of America was sued by the Justice Department for discriminating against mortgage applicants with disabilities. So if this is supposed to be illegal, how does it still happen?
The Fair Housing Act, I think, has been one of the least enforced federal civil rights legislation, landmark legislation that we have. But I will say that the attacks that have come on the Fair Housing Act in the Trump administration have been unlike any other administration before. There's been a wholesale undermining of housing and lending enforcement.
This isn't just about Trump's bigotry in the 1970s. This problem is still happening today. Black and Latinx people continue to be denied mortgages by financial institutions at far higher rates than white people. Far too often, news outlets, especially ones owned by corporations, don't talk about the fundamental human right to housing and how it is threatened in modern society.
I think that sometimes there's a sense that housing discrimination is just about an individual transaction that may have occurred or one bad actor who's denying somebody rent, when actually there are structural and systemic reasons that are promoting discrimination on a much broader level.
Housing discrimination is part of a long history of government and institutional policies that prevent people of color from accumulating wealth and owning property. From colonizing native land, to slavery, to sharecropping, to Jim Crow, to internment, and to countless other policies, people of color have had extra barriers placed between them and home ownership. These barriers have completely shaped where we live and who we live next to, and even several decades after desegregation, America continues to be racially divided because of our housing policies.
The media would be very remiss in thinking that this is just an individual, to individual discrimination transaction.
Let's spend a minute to just talk about the scale of housing discrimination in America. There were 28,181 reported complaints of housing discrimination in 2016, and of these cases, 55% involved discrimination on the basis of disability, 19% of cases were based on racial discrimination, 9% were based on discrimination against families with children, 8% were based on discrimination against national origin, 6% were based on sex or gender discrimination, 1% were based on discrimination against color, 1% were based on religious discrimination, and another 9% were categorized as other. And this is just what we know from what is reported. According to the National Fair Housing Alliance, most people don't report racial, ethnic, or religious housing discrimination. They estimate that there are actually more than 4 million cases of housing discrimination each year.
So I think it remains a lot of barriers to reporting instances of discrimination, sometimes because the racism is much more subtle today than it was before. And yet the importance of reporting is crucial because that is the only way that we can understand and prevent people from engaging in unlawful discrimination to begin with.
And housing discrimination is just part of a larger housing crisis in America. It is really difficult for someone earning minimum wage to rent or buy a home. A person earning the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour would need to work 122 hours a week to afford a 2-bedroom rental home. And if they wanted to buy, they'd have to work 99 hours a week to afford a 1-bedroom home. And for over half of poor households, more than half of their income is spent on rent. Add discrimination on top of these troubling trends, and you can see how big the problem really is.
In too many places in this country, one's zip code determines one's destiny.
Neighborhoods that are predominantly people of color or poorer are not invested in by businesses, have less healthy food options, a lack of pharmacies, and are neglected by public services such as school, building, street, and park maintenance, as well as unreliable garbage collection and public transportation.
This is only going to become more real when the media is actually speaking to people on the ground who are experiencing housing discrimination or lending discrimination.
Black people in this country have to be twice as good to get half as much. And I couldn't even get half.
I was never in the closet in my entire life until now.
Elliot's story is all too common in the gay community. The Equal Rights Center reports 48% of LGBTQ seniors face housing discrimination.
I'm Amy Goodman as we end today's show looking at a new project called the Eviction Lab that looked at more than 80 million eviction records going back to 2000.
Housing is like the most basic right that anybody has. It is fundamental to being a human being, the right to have housing.